Good afternoon and welcome everyone to our data protection webinar on gap analyses, where we hope to help you to identify any weak spots in your data protection armour. Quick intros from me. I'm Zoe Hewitt and I'm the Divisional Director for Privacy at GRC Solutions. I'll explain the branding and the name change in a few slides' time. I started my career in data and database marketing, moving into privacy and data protection for the last 10 years. Until recently, I led the DQM GRC team, and I'm now heading up the merged teams from DQM and GRCI Law to form the new privacy team at GRC Solutions. I'd like to hand over to my extraordinarily talented team and to introduce themselves, starting with Louise.
Thank you, Zoe, and no pressure. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Good afternoon. So my name is Louise Brooks, and I am the Head of Consultancy at DQM GRC. I started my career in the law, qualifying as a solicitor in 2012. I then transitioned into the compliance and data protection space in 2017, before moving into data protection consultancy. And I've been with DQM now for 4 years. In terms of my day-to-day, I support a broad range of clients across both the corporate and not-for-profit sectors, acting as a statutory data protection officer, as well as conducting gap analyses, implementation projects, and helping clients to build out their internal data protection compliance programs. My client base focuses on compliance with UK and EU GDPR, as well as the privacy regulation. So over to you, Ryan.
Thank you, and hi everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Ryan Peeney, and I'm one of the DPO consultants at GRCI Law. I've spent the past decade working in data privacy, data governance, and ISMS compliance, supporting both in-house and consultancy roles. I operate in industries such as health, life sciences, social care, education, engineering, rail industry, hospitality, and luxury retail. And very much of my work is focused around GDPR and ISMS implementation and maturity project delivery. The last 2 years specifically, whilst I've been at GRCI Law, I've been supporting our client portfolio delivering GDPR compliance at various stages. So from little capability, partially complete to maturity programming. Also includes other regulations such as HIPAA compliance and NHS Digital Security Protection Toolkit, and across the advisory role. Nice to meet you all.
Brilliant. Thank you both. Really quick introduction to our company for those that don't know us. We offer cybersecurity and risk management services, training and data protection expertise, providing clients with comprehensive off-the-shelf or tailored solutions to meet their compliance needs. We have a global reach for most of our services. Anyone who knows the ITG brand will start to see a change in the coming months as our different business units come together under the GRC Solutions brand, streamlining services under a single cohesive identity. A few quick webinar etiquette reminders. Participants will be muted during the session. Please use the question mark icon to submit your questions, and we'll definitely email you a copy of the presentation and the recording if you so wish. Quick look at the agenda. We're going to look at compliance vulnerabilities, how effective is a gap analysis. We're going to look at enforcement actions and what type of approach you should take to gap analysis, and then we'll have a live Q&A at the end. So we're going to try and cover that in an hour. So off we go. So quick, really quick before we get started, we just want to run a quick poll to understand where you are on your compliance journey. The options are available now on the screen, and we'd be very grateful for your feedback. So the options you've got are 1, fully compliant, 2, partially compliant, 3, uncertain, need guidance, or 4, not compliant and looking for solutions. I'll just give you 10 more seconds to fill in the poll. Brilliant. Thanks very much for participating in that. It'll help us tailor our communications with you in the future. Now, before we look in detail at what a data protection gap analysis is and how they can benefit your organisation, we're going to spend some time considering the compliance vulnerabilities your organisation might be exposed to, and undertake a data protection gap analysis. Ryan, would you mind providing us with some examples of common data protection vulnerabilities organisations might experience?
Thank you, Zoe. Yes, of course. Yeah. What I'll do just for the audience here, because my bandwidth's quite low, so I'll come off whilst I speak and then jump back on in the interim periods where me and Louise come off and talk about our discussion points. So please bear with me. So, okay, so let's start looking at how to spot compliance vulnerabilities. So overall, it's quite a challenge to discuss these given the breadth of compliance activity required to demonstrate compliance with data protection laws and regulations such as EU and UK GDPR. So in essence, there are a wealth of vulnerabilities that a gap analysis can help you identify. So just at a baseline, the data protection gap analysis assesses an organization's application of data protection principles, data subject rights. So, for example, it assesses the position of completed ROPAs, data protection policies, operational procedures, and risk assessments, and outputs a maturity scoring based on what the input is. So, firstly, we usually start our focus on the data discovery phase. So, this is the first step really to understanding your organization's context in relation to data protection compliance. So really it's quite fundamental that you get this right. So the key pieces to start that journey for data discovery are the records of processing activity, which is a legal requirement under Article 30 of the GDPR, and data mapping and information asset registers. So as I said, it's imperative that your documentation um, represents or you can aim to represent a 360-degree view of your data processing activities alongside the key processing systems and third parties who process on your behalf. So you have to get this right. The devil is in the detail in this process. So if we just take the ROPA, so once that's complete, this is a really great documentation for highlighting the spot on the level of compliance across the 7 data protection principles, and then your data subject rights applicability. So it really underpins further compliance activity required by the organization as well for remediation. So again, it's a key piece to spot on vulnerabilities at almost like the front door of any compliance assessment that's been carried out. So now I'm going to talk about 8 areas that are quite common and that I've had a lot of support with our client portfolio and just my experience in general. So this slide presents 4 of them, then we're going to present 4 on the other. So often in essence, the gap analysis output can help you identify any misalignment with your data processing role. So we see often with organizations that data controller, joint controller, or data processor roles can be a little misaligned. It's usually to do with the former 2, the data controller and joint controller roles. So they might not be established further during your ROPA because the stakeholder involved hasn't really got the right level of knowledge or guides to help them. So in practice, that's beneficial to have a data controller, joint controller, and process a questionnaire to just ensure that those roles can be assessed using that tool. So that's kind of key to any weak spots and vulnerabilities in that area. Secondly, we have data resources. So you find a lot of this with organizations that they're either unresourced somewhere. So whether that's on a people level, technology, or a training level. So what we do is we look at the scope of any vulnerabilities in this area to help with operationalization of your privacy program. So it can be anything from understanding from your data protection framework, from your initial stage, your data discovery, any vulnerabilities in terms of risks. So you might have an idea of some volume of risks, so that they might just be even related to data protection impact assessments, or any legitimate interest assessments, just to give a small example. So you might identify the requirement for a privacy analyst to support with risk analysis across those assessments. You might need to better operationalize the engagement that you have across the organization. So, for example, you might need an automation tool, or there might be training. There might be training specific to your data protection function, where you need a little bit more technical understanding of privacy risks and operations. Or it could be a wider vulnerability, just in terms of the level of knowledge that you have through engagement with key stakeholders. So it's a bit multi-leveled here. But a gap analysis can help you identify some of those weak areas. So it really is it's quite key that you think about engagements. So next we have privacy by design and default. So again, another critical area, which you touched on a little bit with the DPIA. So a comprehensive gap analysis, it will indicate where there's high risk processing carried out by your organization, through that engagement with stakeholder and through your own assessments as well that you're doing on that, to ensure it's accurate and complete. So as required by Article 25 of the EU and UK GDPR, is the methodology to use to bake data protection into systems and processes from the start. So, for example, where you've got sensitive health data, what the gap analysis could do is spot weak spots in that area. So where your DPIA is not comprehensive. So, for example, your template might not have the most recent guidelines from the European Data Protection Board or Working Party 29. So it's quite key that these things are really consulted at that gap analysis stage and the report outputs. We even look at like the operational, so policy procedures and guides as well. So it depends on the enterprise size as well. So you might have a large enterprise, so you really could do with DPIA guides to aid your audience, really, that you're reliant on, who are accountable for completing documentation, for you to get a better understanding of your risk posture. So yeah, again, the gap analysis can identify any weak points with policies, templates, and guides that your organization requires. So the next slide, please. Yes, so next we have personal data breaches. So yeah, again, the gap analysis looks at a very in-depth approach to assessing breach management frameworks. So again, policy procedures, reporting, and resource perspective is very tightly lensed here. So these are important, really, but it's fundamental that the types of personal breach you might experience in your organization. So the process would help you create a personal data breach procedure that staff can be trained on and hopefully reduce the number of breaches. It can also ensure that you have great reporting lines, just in terms of what's proportional in terms of developing quite a comprehensive risk assessment. So often we see data breach forms that are internal data breach forms that are very thin they don't really, you think of it as you have to think of it as a comprehensive risk assessment. So the gap analysis will enable you to understand, whether that presents gaps, or whether you need a refresh or an absolutely new rebuild of those internal report forms. It will also enable you to understand your technical and organizational measures that you evidently need to deploy to prevent breaches as well. And just lastly, the breaches that you do experience, they should highlight any weaknesses in your organization's data protection management framework, so which you can hopefully fix. So, for example, developing more comprehensive breach forms, as we touched on, or better improvements related to automation. So, where you want tools to carry out quicker reporting lines because you might have a high volume of breach and attack associated with your organization. So, that would give you better insight. So, it's just worth noting over time that you can analyze that data, for example. So, you might see an increase or decrease in reported data breaches that might indicate, for example, if there's data protection training that isn't clear enough within the business, just as well as your operational weak points. Okay, so we've got data subject rights, which is kind of sandwiched into this section here. So this area as well, you can and will help you validate data subject right applicability. So there's often gaps here, but the gap analysis report output as well will assess the effectiveness of your policies, procedures, and resource that might help you remediate any weak spots. So in summary, it will help your organization identify these weak spots with those policies, procedures, work streams, if identified. It might just be a small policy refresh, or you might need to build up the game from the ground because there's a change management area that you've got an automation tool introduced, which we can help with in terms of implementation advice as well. Next, we move on to third parties. So it's essential that you think about your relationships with third parties that support your organization to deliver its goods and services. So for example, an outsourced HR function or haulage companies that deliver product to customers, or your payment processors that facilitate, for example, online web orders, or another organization that you partner with to deliver your aims and objectives. So whatever the reason for engaging that party, if personal data is involved, then your organization needs to, ensure that you have the contractual agreement in place. So some of them have specific provisions, given that the contract might differ depending on the capacity that each party is acting in. So I think here the important thing is that both parties are clear about the roles and responsibilities when it comes to data protection compliance. Again, the gap analysis output can detail what that is with a pragmatic approach to remediating any gaps here. So it doesn't really stop there. You'll need to manage third party relationships as well. So you'll need to just ensure that the contractual obligations through are consulted through the actual supplier due diligence assessments as well. So you have your risk assessments running alongside those. In my time, I've seen very short risk assessments, or we've been asked to drill ours back, and they contain all the requirements that you need. So under GDPR policies to help demonstrate that the security posture of the supplier is suitable or not, or where you can consult on risks. So you've got a bit more of a robust risk management profile. So again, gap analysis can highlight any gaps in this area for you. Next, we move on to risk management. So you want to consider your organization's data protection risk management framework, and whether that's, operationally, is that working in order to evaluate the data protection risks that your organization's, is ultimately having. Well, it really kind of creates the lens on your data risk profile, really. So remember that the risk management for data protection is typically usually a broader framework that's part of your corporate risk. So the more robust your data protection risk management framework is, that's your risk register. So that's the key document here. So which lists your or helps you to identify your data protection risks. That it's robust enough, and the assessments that have come before it, like we go back to data discovery and then obviously privacy by design, that they're comprehensive enough to inform um, that risk level, the level of risk, to get a clear idea of your risk posture and remediations that are required as well as part of your risk management framework. So again, the gap analysis will review your policy, procedure, and processes to ensure that there's a level of assurance there. So that's quite key and in the gap analysis process. So last we have external threats. So if we just think about the cyber threat landscape, so we've got malicious activities, originating from outside your organization, um, with the aim to compromise your data and systems. So various forms are here, right? So we've got phishing attacks, malware, ransom attacks, denial of service, and supply chain issues. So, and just in summary, so if you've experienced any of these threats, you should have a good understanding of your security position. So you should know where the vulnerabilities are in data, essentially in your data and systems architecture. So whether it's information security and data protection policies and procedures are fit for purpose, or whether they made a little bit of a bolstering and a refresh. Um, so yeah, again, the gap analysis will detail any of these vulnerabilities for you, but um, yeah, I think regular risk assessments, you know, that are simulated as threat exercises can help uncover these gaps really early as well, and identify any weak points that may be exploited by attackers. So it's kind of key that you consider that as well. But really strengthening these areas in a proactive way only protects the sensitive data essentially and avoids you from regulatory scrutiny and reputational damage. So yeah, if not, threat actors come knocking on the door. So just in short, so by performing the gap analysis, you'll be able to explore the intersection really of privacy and information security, just to identify any weak spots there. So they can even just be something around training on various types of social engineering attacks. So what you really want to do is examine ways that to better align as well with privacy and information security functions for overall governance and accountability. So whether they're in-house, external, via external services for cybersecurity and stuff, you just want to ensure who's responsible for, for example, managing the security training awareness programs, and keeping your business informed on them. So really, just understanding that interplay in the creation and monitoring of them, to better understand risks in this area. So yeah, sorry, a lot to kind of talk about. I could go on and on, but that's all from me in terms of vulnerabilities identified by performing gap analysis. So thanks for listening. Hopefully that was really insightful for the audience today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Plenty of potential weak spots there to go and have a look at.
Yeah, there's a plethora of, of
Um,
areas.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So, another quick poll, everybody. Sorry about that. This time we're asking, what's the biggest challenge your organisation faces with GDPR compliance? So, is it one, understanding regulatory requirements? Two, getting buy-in to conduct a gap analysis? Three, implementing data protection recommendations, or four, keeping up with changing regulations? I'll just give you a few more seconds to complete that. It'll be very helpful if you could. Brilliant. Thank you very much for completing our second poll. We're now going to move on to look at gap analyses and what you need to consider before conducting one. Louise, can you tell us a bit about what a gap analysis assessment is, why they're important, and any practical tips for conducting one, please?
Thanks, Sarah. So as you suggested, I think before we think about the practical considerations, we want to have a really clear understanding of what a gap analysis is, and that needs to be front of mind before we can really get into the detail. So at DQM, we consider a gap analysis to be a robust assessment of your data protection compliance against the relevant data protection legislation that your organisation is bound by. So what does that look like in practice? That means you're looking at the way your organisation uses personal data and comparing that against the law to consider whether your processing is compliant. So with that in mind, the first practical consideration is defining the scope of the assessment. So this means identifying the applicable legislation. Now, hopefully, this is all going to be really clear to you, but if not, you need to think about where your organisation geographically operates and where the people you engage with are located. So most of you here today are likely to be considering the EU and or the UK GDPR, but there are many other jurisdictions around the world with similar laws in place, such as the CCPA or HIPAA in the US. It's really important to identify the relevant laws to assess your data protection practices against, because if you don't have that context, you're not going to be able to accurately identify where improvements can be made. So once you've defined the legislative scope, you then need to think about the assessment scope. So normally our clients want us to assess the entire organisation, but it is possible to conduct assessments on specific areas of your organisation as well. So for example, you could look at how your organisation responds to data subject rights requests under the UK GDPR, or carry out an analysis of the technical and organisational measures that you use to keep personal data safe. Or you might even want to just look at your retention and deletion practices. Whichever option you choose, you need to get that right from the outset to get the most from the process. So the next step is to define your objectives. Now, clearly your defined objectives are going to include something along the lines of comply with the law, but what does that mean in practice? So as we know, the GDPR is principles-based legislation. So that means we don't have a prescriptive list of do's and don'ts that we can rely on to effectively translate the legal requirements of the GDPR into practical objectives. So what you need to think about here is, what are your benchmarks for compliance? What essentially are your compliance goals? What's the outcome or outcomes that you're striving to achieve? So you're going to be considering if your organisation has data protection objectives that it's aiming for. So is there an articulated risk tolerance that you're trying to stick to? When we conduct a gap analysis, clients generally reply to these questions in one of two ways. Either they don't have a sense of where their compliance is at all and they simply want a sense check or a rough idea of where their compliance status sits. But they want they have a rough idea of where their compliance status sits, but they simply want a sense check. So they have a rough idea of where they are, but they want an objective outsider to give them independent evidence that they can present to their senior leaders, maybe because, as in our poll, we're struggling to get buy-in, or conversely, they want to be able to demonstrate how well their internal data protection colleagues are fulfilling their roles and responsibilities. So I think it's worth noting here that our GDPR gap analysis assessment looks at 9 areas and it produces a score out of 10. So a score of 7.5 and above would demonstrate that an organisation is able to clearly demonstrate a good level of assurance, that it's got controls in place and a strong grasp of the legal requirements. And a mark below 5 would indicate a limited level of assurance, and that's a pretty strong indication that there's likely to be quite a lot of work to be done, especially with regards to the basics that Ryan talked about around implementing an Article 30 report and creating your policies and procedures. So we then move on to gathering evidence, which we recommend is done in 2 parts. So first, we recommend you assess your written documentation, and then secondly, you interview key stakeholders. So here what you're concerned with is ensuring your organisation has documented its standards that it wants to strive for and the requirements it's setting staff in its policies and procedures. But then you're also, through the interviews, checking that those policies and procedures are being followed. An added benefit is that it's also a good opportunity to check that departments or teams that work closely together are working together effectively. So then once you have the evidence, you analyse the gaps. So this is about comparing the current state of your data protection compliance against your defined objectives to identify any discrepancies. So for example, if your internal policies state that you want to acknowledge a communication from a data subject that is exercising one of their rights within a defined time frame, say you want to acknowledge their request within 48 hours, your assessment will hopefully evidence whether or not that defined time frame is being met. So then the gaps you've identified will help you create an action plan to make your improvements. So this plan will ideally include specific actions that you want to undertake against a preferred timeline. And it should also allocate tasks to relevant individuals, because it's highly unlikely that you or even your team are going to be able to make all of the changes that you need to make on your own. You're going to need collaboration from your colleagues. So you want your plan to be clear to all the relevant stakeholders that you need on your side to help you make the changes. And then finally, you're going to want to monitor your organisation's progress against the assessment action plan, just to make sure that you're staying on track with making the changes that you want to make. So this is likely to involve reporting against the action plan, conducting regular check-ins and reviews with team members across your organisation. It might also involve maybe undertaking a mini assessment against the action plan throughout your implementation project, just to check that everyone's on track. And then as part of this process of monitoring and reviewing, you're going to want to keep abreast of changes in the regulatory landscape as well, because sometimes those regulatory changes can impact the outcome of your assessment, particularly if those changes are going to affect your risk appetite or exposure. So for example, here in the UK at the moment, there's a bill currently going through Parliament to amend the UK GDPR, and keeping abreast of that bill as it makes its way through the legal process will mean that you are best placed to understand how it will impact your organisation when it does finally become law.
Thank you, Louise. Lots of tips and tricks there, and reinforces why it's really useful to have a gap analysis for your organisation. To kick off the next section of the webinar, Louise again is going to talk us through some recent enforcement actions. Sorry about that, Louise. Enforcement actions to provide greater insight into the potential consequences for poor data protection practices. Perhaps you could start by answering the question, are organisations legally required to have data protection assessments?
That's a really great question. And whilst gap analyses are not legally mandated by the EU or the UK GDPR, they're highly recommended. We think that they're a really crucial tool to help you implement and maintain data protection compliance. They're a really good way as well of you being able to evidence your organisation's commitment to its data protection programme. They can also be really useful pieces of information if you're faced with discussing your compliance with a regulator, like the Information Commissioner's Office here in the UK. So whilst organisations won't experience regulatory scrutiny for failing to have a data protection assessment, the cases we're now going to look at provide practical examples of where a gap analysis might have been useful. So the first case that I wanted to start with was a recent case from the EU. So in October last year, the Irish Data Protection Commission, the DPC, fined LinkedIn Ireland €310 million for its processing of personal data for behavioural analysis and targeted advertising purposes. So this case started with a complaint made by a French non-profit organisation to the French Data Protection Authority. But as LinkedIn's EU business operations are headquartered in Ireland, the DPC took over the case as the lead supervisory authority. So the complaint led to an inquiry that examined the way LinkedIn Ireland was complying with the lawfulness, fairness and transparency principle and its various obligations to provide privacy information to people using their services, both from a first-party personal data perspective, i.e. where an individual is giving their information directly to LinkedIn, but also from a third-party data perspective as well for those LinkedIn members with registered profiles that hadn't necessarily given their information directly to LinkedIn. So in terms of the lawful basis for processing, LinkedIn was not able to successfully establish any of the 6 lawful bases for processing as being appropriate for its purposes. So in particular, the DPC looked at whether the LinkedIn could apply consent, contractual necessity or legitimate interest, but it found that LinkedIn was not able to meet any of the legal requirements for those lawful bases. So what this meant was that LinkedIn was actually unlawfully processing personal data. The DPC also found that LinkedIn had not given data subjects appropriate information about its purposes for processing. So privacy information should set out, amongst other things, why the personal data is being collected, what it will be used for, and who it will be shared with. And by not providing that information to people, LinkedIn's processing of personal data for the identified purposes was unfair. So if we assume that LinkedIn wanted to be compliant, but had somehow missed the mark, there are several ways this fine could have been prevented or at the very least reduced. So if LinkedIn had focused on things like its data flow mapping, completing an Article 30 report, and embedding data protection by design and default, all of those things would have facilitated the right decisions being made about the lawful basis for processing and the content of privacy information. So this case doesn't give us a quick fix solution, but it rather demonstrates that there are lots of building blocks that taken together create a strong compliance structure. And the outcome of the case suggests to us that LinkedIn was either missing some of the basic requirements of the GDPR, or the work they had done in these areas was a work in progress. So the next case I wanted to talk about was the Police Service for Northern Ireland monetary penalty notice that was issued by the ICO. This case started with a request under the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA as it's abbreviated to. This act entitles members of the public to ask public authorities for information. So the FOIA request in this case was just for the number of officers at each rank and the number of staff at each grade. Now, in response to the request, an Excel spreadsheet was prepared that mistakenly had a hidden tab that actually exposed the surnames, initials, ranks, roles, and other details, including surveillance and intelligence, for all 9,483 serving PSNI officers and staff. And that spreadsheet was briefly available online. So the impact of this case on the serving officers just can't be underestimated, because in a statement following the incident, PSNI confirmed that the information was actually in possession of dissident Republican groups, and there were some real security threats against police officers, and some staff even reportedly had to move home. And an independent review was conducted after the incident, and in that review it reported that this was the most significant data breach that has ever occurred in the history of UK policing. This was because of the nature and volume of the compromised data, but also because of the political history and the context of contemporary policing in Northern Ireland. So what are the data protection implications here? So first, the case demonstrates poor data management practices. The policies and procedures in place to help employees to respond to FOIA requests were found to be inadequate. And there was also a lack of segregation between data sets, those containing sensitive and those containing non-sensitive personal data. Secondly, PSNI failed to implement appropriate technical and organisational measures to keep the personal data secure. So from a security measures perspective, PSNI did not have robust access controls in place. There was poor training and awareness practices, and information security policies and procedures were found to be inadequate. So how might a gap analysis have addressed some of these issues? Well, hopefully the assessment would have highlighted all of those failings and provided a list of remediatory actions. So, for example, the assessment might have interrogated the FOIA process and discovered that some of the relevant internal guidance had not been fully integrated into practical processes. The assessment might also have recommended a process of peer reviews for all responses to FOIA requests prior to them being released to the requester. And it might also have highlighted gaps in the training and awareness programme that's promoted to staff. Finally, it might have recommended a risk assessment of PSNI's FOIA practices to determine whether the security measures used to keep the personal data safe were appropriate, for example, by assessing access controls. Thank you, Zoe.
That was really interesting, Louise. Thank you. Perhaps we can now look at how a gap analysis could be used to help maintain compliance. Ryan, could you take us through the benefits of a gap analysis, please?
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah, and really insightful, Louise. So, yeah, hopefully the audience has taken quite a lot from this session already. Again, my bandwidth is not too good, so I will just come off my camera and then pop back on at the end of my session. Okay, so yeah, topic of benefits of a gap analysis. So yes, again, you can script off a lot from this, but really it just depends on the organization's context and what the scoring of its compliance maturity are. So I'm just going to kind of cover some of the kind of like general here. So I mean, overall, we think it's important for organizations to regularly assess the data protection compliance for several reasons. So one of them is it can highlight, weak spots in your data protection compliance program. So where vulnerabilities exist. So that's a real great benefit. So you can get a sense of the understanding of your risk exposure, and then you have the ability then to work out what the appropriate control measures should be in place. So and then for organizations that have already, have an idea of its risk profile and risk tolerance. So the outcome of the gap analysis reports can confirm, how well that's kind of operating within those parameters. So it will score you on a maturity scale of between 1 to 10, 10 being absolutely excellent, great job done, to 1 being in a very red zone. So which is not, I've not come across that ever before, but yeah, that's it's really great for risk profiling. Huge benefits there. Also, you can check the effectiveness of your technical and organization control measures as well. So you can look at how control measures are appropriate to the level of processing and the categories of data that's processing. If there are gaps, that are highlighted from legacy work as well. So it really, we go into these roles, don't we? And we there is some legacy work to do when we settle up on a kind of clear program, which a gap analysis is clearly beneficial in that way. But often there's legacy work to clear up as well. So it's a really great idea as well to, I think Louisa touches on this as well, which is the importance of reviewing documentation, like existing documentation. You must have that as part of your data protection framework. Often, again, there's the challenge of, there's not enough resources to do that because you're trying to steer the privacy engine or operating room for supporting the business with new initiatives and projects. So again, you don't really have the time to look over any legacy gaps. So a gap analysis can help you consult on this as well and kind of highlight those gaps just to give you an idea of more of a comprehensive risk output. You can also, sorry, just the example on the control measures as well. So it looks into access controls, data anonymization and pseudonymization practices, encryption management, data retention rules, international transfers, etc. So you might find as well that from the gap analysis output that there are, some of these controls are inadequate. So it's a great benefit to perform one to look at those improvements that need to be implemented. Again, Louise touched on this topic before, but if you are struggling to get buy-in for your compliance program, or you need to demonstrate the impact of the program, so a gap analysis report will derive this output for you. So a really key benefit there. And then we just come to a last few points here. So again, given that there'll be an action plan output in the gap analysis, it'll help you assess maturity level as well through the risk scoring, and give you opportunity to remediate those risks as well, so that you are raising your risk profile to try and improve the opportunity for new commercial benefits. So where you can win new projects by demonstrating your maturity level, and any remediations to pull that level up into an acceptable or even an even greater overall risk posture. So yeah, it's I think. Oh yeah, lastly, yeah. So if again as well, which is just from a regulatory standpoint, which Louise has touched on. So the gap analysis, together with your action plan, um, is quite valuable. Just in those situations where you're faced by regulatory scrutiny, so you can demonstrate, what efforts you have carried out, just to ensure you can demonstrate compliance with applicable laws and regulations, and just how well. I mean, what happens is you might conduct one this year, and then in 2 years, because depending on the size of your organization and the action plans remediated, you have evidence of that high level scoring as well. So they're really good documents to kind of build on your current programs, and obviously provide where needed to regulators and your key stakeholders. So yeah, that's it from me. And yeah, hope you found that really useful. And thanks again.
Thank you, Ryan. So if you're still back at the starting gate and you're slightly worried about conducting a gap analysis, perhaps you undertake our next poll, which is just a really quick snapshot of where you are, whether you'd like a free consultation, whether you need more detail, or whether you handle this internally. Again, all of this will help us to build a better picture of our audience, and so that we can communicate to you and try and help you through your compliance issues. So if you could fill those in, that would be super. You'll be happy to hear this is the last poll. And I think that's the end of that poll. So I think we're now moving on to Q&A. We seem to have more time for Q&A. So if anybody's got any questions, please fire them in right now. And I can see that I've got a few already. So I'll perhaps just kick off with one, just as a starting point. So guys, Ryan and Louise, aside from data protection assurance, does an assessment have other benefits?
Yeah, I can start with that one. So, yeah, I think it's going to demonstrate the effectiveness of your data protection function. So it's going to give evidence to your senior leaders of the effectiveness of your team. Hopefully, there's one or two of you working together to implement your data protection practices. And so you can report against that. You can show stats and statistics, so you can demonstrate that your training that you might be doing with staff is improving the number of breaches that you're receiving, either because you're getting less breaches or because they're less serious. And it also acts, I think, as a really important accountability document for should you ever receive regulatory scrutiny. So if you are in conversation with someone like the ICO, if you can demonstrate a program of assessments throughout your organisation, it's going to demonstrate that you take your data protection compliance seriously and that you are keen on making sure that you do the right thing and implement the right measures to mitigate the risks that you're exposed to.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Did you have anything else to add to that, Ryan? Or were you happy with that answer?
Yeah, again, just from an operational point of view as well, just kind of, it'll help, highlight any gaps there that you need to improve as well. There could be something from purely a communications perspective as well. So it could be how well you asset people with information of how to kind of collaborate as well to complete compliance documentation. It's an absolute burden, wherever we are, whatever we're faced with. And yeah, often you find that there are a lot of inconsistencies as well. So again,
Good.
kind of the benefits of gap analysis can really highlight that as well. And yeah,
Yeah.
we can do our magic to support guides, documentation, etc.
Yeah.
So
Brilliant.
yeah, it's one.
Probably linked to that last question quite nicely, actually, is another question that's come in, which is how often should we be completing data protection assessments?
So without
Yeah.
wanting to sound like a typical consultant hedging their bets, I think this is all really going to depend upon your context. So it really depends on things like, the types of personal data that you're processing, your areas of operation, who you share personal data with, whether your personal data is sensitive in any way, if it meets the definition of special category. So I think it is going to depend on the context, but that having been said, generally speaking, as a very broad brush rule, we would expect to see sort of small to medium sized organisation maybe undertaking a gap analysis every 1 to 3 years, but with the larger and enterprise solution type organisations, it's likely that their processes are generally going to require a gap analysis probably every year.
Yeah. And it's also a good thing to do every year to demonstrate to the board that the progress has been made as well. But that's
Yeah,
just me
absolutely, for
chipping in.
sure. Yeah.
There's some really key
Um,
metrics in that, isn't there, as well, to derive as well that you can present as on a high
absolutely.
level.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
and then you've got your remediation analysis then off the back of your action
yeah,
plans. So
yeah.
Sure. And if as an
Cool.
organization you're, the things that you do to achieve your aims and objectives, so, your services, your goods, your delivery, if your operations remain the same, there's going to become a point at which having a continual assessment may not have its added benefits, but you may then want to think about, okay, the context of when your operational activities change, and that becomes your trigger. So rather than stick to a rudimentary 1 to 3 years, you have triggers within your processes that stipulate when a gap analysis would be a good idea. So by that I mean, are you going to suddenly start outsourcing more of your activities? Do you foresee big IT projects on the horizon? Are you going through a merger or acquisition? Have you suddenly had a lot of new hires within your organisation? All of those things, as well as the context I spoke about previously, are also going to inform your programme of assessments, I think.
I think another linked question to this that's come in, which is how can we ensure that our assessment process is thorough and unbiased? So that's kind of an internal, external kind of slant to that.
yeah,
Yeah, for sure. And I personally, I think that it's really difficult to achieve an unbiased assessment process if they're conducted internally. You're more likely to get a true and accurate assessment if you appoint an external assessor. If it's not possible for you to do that, then you need to think about the position of the individuals internally that were going to carry out the assessment. So, you know, you need to think about, are they actually or potentially conflicted, for example? So do they have to take operational decisions that might conflict with their obligations to carry out an assessment? You know, if they are potentially conflicted, is there anyone else within the organisation that might be able to shadow their work or peer review it? What do you think, Ryan? Is anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I think externally I've got quite a lot to say because obviously we're quite heavily involved in gap analysis reporting. So yeah, externally you get a bunch of you get several SMEs. So you've got different heads, different challenge members looking into different areas. So might have one initial interviewer, conducting all the interviews with you to obtain all that information. But there's at least one of our management consultants. Then, we have a main DPO as well, who's part of the client account, who's primary contact, and then we have a copy and edit team that are reviewing it as well. So again, yeah, it's pretty priceless to kind of outsource that. But yeah, great tips though, Louise, on the internal. You really do need to think about that profile of the challenge member if you're taking it internally.
I think it's also about the framework, the methodology, the speed, the all the knowledge, all of those things that go
Mm-hmm.
into. And as you said, Ryan, it's kind of it's a bit of a no-brainer to outsource this type of activity. You might want to do some of the remediation yourself if you've got a qualified person to do so. However, this type of work is probably anyway enough.
Yeah, it's always a burden.
You would say that.
But I would say that, wouldn't I? Yeah, I know.
But don't forget though that if you do outsource it, there is a lot that you need to to schedule anyway, because there's a lot of coordination. But it depends on the size of the organisation as well. There's a vast amount of
Yeah,
information that we have in our
absolutely.
our processes, our product. So and then there's coordination of that. There's a bit of visibility that
Yeah,
organizations to do to make people aware what's coming, to be prepared. So there is a
yeah,
lot of that comes as well. Again,
absolutely.
organization size is always going to be the burden, and how well resourced you are
Yeah.
against what you need to do, just in terms to agree an action plan as well, because
And
you might not agree with our you
and
know
also how
our boutique
honest people are
approach.
going to be, how honest people are going to be with an
Yeah.
internal person.
Yeah. So
Uh,
that's where many caps,
mm,
at least kind of like
exactly.
the exposure that
Yeah,
our
yeah,
organisation's got in DQM is pretty granular for that output. So
exactly. Yeah, hundreds and hundreds of questions. Anyway,
yeah.
okay, so actually another neat question segueing into this. What are some common challenges faced during a data protection assessment, and how can they be overcome?
Oh wow. I mean, how to summarize that? How to summarize? That's a really good question. How to provide
We've
a
only got a
short,
minute
sharp
and a
answer to
half,
that one.
Louise.
So I think if I could just whistle through them, that the first is that data protection often isn't embedded. So by that I mean your organisation has policies and procedures, and maybe they've mapped the data flows, all of that good stuff, but they're gathering dust. They're often either not referred to, or they're used unless they're reviewed as part of like an annual update process. So you really want to check that those policies and procedures are actually being considered by your colleagues. Another is that maybe organisations are struggling to get buy-in, and there can be lots of different reasons why. And we can empathise, because organisations have a lot of competing obligations and requirements that they have to get to, and sometimes something has to give. But I think the GDPR does carry significant fines. It can have huge reputational damage. So when we encounter this as an issue, what we try to do is to encourage an organisation to see the benefits of compliance, both from a regulatory perspective, but also from an operational perspective as well. And we try to help them see ways to embed that compliance into BAU operations without it becoming too burdensome. And then the only other thing I would raise is that we often see a lot of shadow IT and data sets sitting outside of formal systems. So this might look like, a team downloading an app or a piece of software for a free trial and not running it past IT, or, teams using their personal OneDrive to save information rather than the organizational approved SharePoint. So these types of practices make ownership and accountability for compliance really difficult and can introduce unquantified risks into your organization. So I suppose as a really quick answer, those are my top 3 challenges that I often see.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm not sure, but I think we're possibly out of time.
I think we are.
So yeah, so thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. It's been really, really good. I hope you've learned something, and if you've got any questions, please contact us on any of the emails, phone. Nobody writes anymore, but you know what I mean. Get in contact with us and we'll be more than happy to help you. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.
Thanks again. Have a good day.